There are cities that time has forgotten, and there are cities which time can never forget. Throughout history, there have been many holy cities and many places of legend. But this is the city where history began, and some believe the city where history will end. This is Jerusalem. And the story is told here, the story of God and the story of man. It's a city of conquerors and empires which have long since faded from memory. It's a city of wonders and miracles which could have, over time, been forgotten if they had not been kept alive by faith and the scriptures. It's a city which has been completely destroyed dozens of times. And through it all, through the rich and diverse history which has stretched over 3,000 years, Jerusalem has survived. It remains the center of the world's faith. And because it's a city of the Spirit, it has aroused in its conquerors a lust for control that no amount of material treasure could ever satisfy. It has aroused in its pilgrims a desire to see what no other destination could ever match. In the first hour of the program, we explored Jerusalem's troubled history as the holiest site in the Jewish faith. We've seen an array of historical figures march through the gates, from King David to King Solomon to Alexander the Great to King Herod. Please join me now as we continue our journey through the gates of time, the story of the 8 gates of Jerusalem. Today, Jerusalem's walls are actually breached by 7 working gates, and one gate that was purposely closed nearly 1,300 years ago. The obstructed gate is the beautiful Golden Gate, an entrance that was sealed off by Muslim conquerors, determined to stop the prophesied entry into the city by a Jewish Messiah. This gate remains clearly visible in the city walls, waiting for the dramatic events millions believe will precede the end of the world. In our first hour, we looked at the 4 gates that open to the spirit of the city, the gates most closely tied to Jerusalem's varied and contentious religious life. We traveled through the New Gate and the Lion's Gate, commonly used by the Christians who live in and travel to Jerusalem. The Lion's Gate in particular opens onto the sacred Via Dolorosa, the street Jesus walked to his crucifixion. The Damascus Gate, a beautiful structure now used by the masses of Muslim faithful heading to prayer at the mosque and holy sites on the Temple Mount. And the fascinating Dung Gate, which allows Jewish worshippers to walk to their most holy site, the Western Wall. Here, the Orthodox can be heard praying that the Jewish temple, which once graced this site, will someday be rebuilt. But there are 3 gates that tell the story of the warring and bloodshed that threaten Jerusalem even to this day. Gates that can tell stories of conflict and conquerors. This is the Zion Gate. It is scarred and pocked with Jordanian bullet holes. This gate bore the brunt of the conflict outside the city walls during the Six-Day War. Through the Jaffa Gate, recent European conquerors and foreign ideas forced their way into the city. And Herod's Gate, Here, 12th century crusaders surmounted the walls of the old city in their effort to wrest Jerusalem from Muslim control. The words are everywhere. In everyone's mind and on the tip of every tongue. The words are from the Bible. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. It has been a city that kings and rulers have longed to possess. Almost all have come from the north to stake their claim. David, Solomon, Nebuchadnezzar, Alexander the Great, Caesar, Herod, Suleiman the Magnificent, and Napoleon. How could so much blood be shed and so much misery inflicted over a city with almost no natural resources? No river access, no seaport, and far from any important trade route. What has made this city valuable in the eyes of almost all who have come here is not material riches or natural resources. It is, in one word, God. Throughout history, the world has believed that these are God's chosen hills. Some believe that by entering one of the stone gates of Jerusalem, the chosen are as close to God as they will ever be on this earth. In the book of Psalms, a poet sang of his love for the city. If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. Let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth, if I prefer not Jerusalem above my highest joys. Herod's Gate, called the Flower Gate in Arabic, is in the northeastern part of the city. Today it is an entrance into the Muslim quarter of the old city. The least impressive and most easily overlooked gate, it has witnessed the most spectacular invasions of Jerusalem. Herod's Gate is a structure that dates back to the 16th century, when the Turkish ruler Suleiman the Magnificent began rebuilding the city's walls and infrastructure. Herod's Gate now leads through a narrow layer of shops and homes of the Muslim quarter. There are some indications that earlier gates at this location might have led to the land of the Jewish tribes, Ephraim, and therefore might have been called the Ephraim Gate. But this cut in the old wall was later named for Herod the Great, who rebuilt the sacred Jewish temple shortly before the birth of Christ. Herod's Gate's only liability is that it faces north, the direction from which Jerusalem's enemies seem to come. The idea that trouble often comes from the north wasn't a new concept for early residents of this ancient city. In fact, 600 years before the birth of Christ, the Jewish prophet Jeremiah predicted violent attacks from the north. For his unpopular predictions, Jeremiah's writings were burned, and he was banished to a cave, which is believed to be only a short distance from what is now Herod's Gate. The old prophet continued his writing and prophesying of future wars and pestilence, even after he was banished. In the old Jerusalem book that carries his name, Jeremiah predicted, "For disaster looms out of the north, even terrible destruction." And he was right. Over the walls near Herod's Gate came Nebuchadnezzar, banishing all in his wake. Over these walls came Titus to completely destroy Jewish civilization. Over these walls came Christian crusaders, unleashing the worst killing spree Jerusalem has ever known. And over these stones came Saladin, Sultan of Egypt, to drive out the Christians. Standing in the gates of Jerusalem, Jeremiah cut off his hair and cast it away, and predicted that all gladness and mirth would fail this city, and Jerusalem would be desolate. From the north they came, burning, pillaging, killing, and exiling. Alexander the Great walked through the gates of Jerusalem in 334 BC, not as a conqueror, but as a friend. Alexander, according to tradition, was greeted by the Jewish leaders and told how his arrival had been prophesied by Daniel. Alexander was so impressed he did not overthrow Jerusalem. He and the Greek Empire, which succeeded him, brought a new invasion of Western values to the city. Alexander the Great believed in a one-world civilization, a brotherhood of man in which all people were united in a similar cultural practice. It was an enlightened idea for its time, but it did not sit well with traditional Jewish faith. The Greeks were, for the most part, tolerant of many cultural practices of the people in their empire, and for a considerable time, Jewish and Greek colonies lived side by side in Jerusalem without much disagreement. Greece was an admired empire, exporting a way of life that was highly seductive to the young people of Jerusalem. Many Jews were taken in by the modern, cosmopolitan ways of the Greeks and readily integrated with them. Greek culture was an awesome force, and most educated Jews found it irresistible. The Greeks were magnificent architects, and they excelled in poetry, philosophy, theater, and other arts. As traders, none had matched them for 1,000 years. Greek culture, or Hellenism as it was known, promised Judea a glorious future, but it also threatened to destroy Judea. Slowly but surely, Jerusalem was transformed into a Hellenic city, adapting Greek lifestyles and institutions. But Greek culture was full of excesses, supported by mythology for its spiritual direction. To protect themselves from this polluting influence, the Jews began to put up walls and barriers to keep their culture separate from the Greeks. In response, the Greeks issued the first anti-Semitic writings during this era. Slowly, tensions began developing between these two cultures. When the Syrian Emperor Antiochus Epiphanes came to power, things became worse. Antiochus wanted the entire empire to be more Hellenic. Seeing the Jewish faith as ancient, backward, and an embarrassment to his vision for a glorious empire, Antiochus banned circumcision and recognition of the Sabbath. He renamed Jerusalem Antiocha. A Greek gymnasium was built at the base of the Temple Mount, where uncircumcised naked men performed exercises in public. This event alone shocked and deeply offended the conservative Jewish community. Antiochus ordered the rebuilt Second Temple to be converted into a shrine to Zeus, the ultimate Greek god. Antiochus humiliated all of Israel when he sacrificed a pig on the altar of the temple. He boiled its remains and poured the broth over the sacred vessels, defiling and desecrating everything in the temple. The Jewish community of Jerusalem was now faced with three options. Some converted to worshiping the Greek gods. Others continued to practice circumcision and observance of the Sabbath away from the eyes of the authorities. A third group faced honorable death by openly defying Hellenism. Sensing that the Jewish community was stubbornly and openly flaunting him, Antiochus stormed through the gates of Jerusalem like a wild beast and massacred young and old. He killed an estimated 40,000 people and sacked the temple, carrying off gold worth millions. In response to Greek repression, a revolt was launched in 167 BC. The Jews began a national war of resistance against the Syrians. It was led by Matthias and his 5 sons from the house of Hasmon, also known as the Maccabees, which means hammerer. They led a guerrilla war attacking from the hills surrounding Jerusalem, hammering their Syrian oppressors. 3 years later, the desecrated temple was captured and reconsecrated by the Maccabees. They destroyed the image of Zeus and cleansed the temple, restoring and sanctifying it for worship. After taking the temple, the Maccabees discovered that the temple's light had only 1 day's supply of oil. It would take 8 days to prepare more oil. The temple menorah had to be lit always. Miraculously, as legend tells us, the fire and the oil lasted for 8 days until a new supply of oil could be ready. This event is commemorated in the story of Hanukkah, which means dedication, or also the Festival of Lights. On this day, Jewish people all around the world light candles on a special menorah designed for this purpose. The menorah is the symbol of the nation of Israel. Some of the bloodiest and most constant fighting swept down on the area when the Crusades began, late in the 11th century. Ruling Turks restricted travel to Jerusalem and to the holy sites. A trip to the Holy Land was often imposed as a penance on Roman Catholic worshippers of the day. Christians, who believed a pilgrimage to the Holy Land was a religious duty, grew more and more angry with the Turks. Jerusalem had been under Muslim control since the 7th century, when, not long after the death of Muhammad, the Arab caliphs moved into Jerusalem and conquered the old city. Initially, the Arab invaders were tolerant of other faiths. For a period, Jews and Christians had relatively free access to the holy sites. But in 1071 AD, control of Jerusalem passed from the Egyptians to the Turks. They were less tolerant and restricted access to many of Jerusalem's holy places. They were even believed to have desecrated many of the sacred sites. Pope Urban II gave a speech at the Council of Clermont in France in 1095, calling on the Christians to do their moral duty to save the holy places. He called for volunteers to retake Jerusalem. Shouting their battle cry, "God wills it," thousands took up the Crusader cross and set out for Jerusalem. The first Crusaders were ill-trained and poorly armed, and the expeditions were under-financed. But a short time later, a better-equipped army of French and Norman knights joined forces in Constantinople. Launching savage battles, Crusaders captured Antioch in 1098 AD, and finally overwhelmed Jerusalem in 1099 AD. The Crusaders' siege of the city lasted nearly 40 days, and thousands were slaughtered. When the Crusaders finally breached the north wall and stormed the city, they butchered most of the Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. Even those who had fled to their mosques or synagogues for protection were not spared. Rulers of the new Kingdom of Jerusalem began taking steps to protect the holy sites and visiting pilgrims. The well-known Order of the Knights Templar was founded in about 1119 AD. These soldiers, in their white cloaks decorated with a red Maltese cross, traveled the land protecting the faithful. Today, the sacred Al-Aqsa Mosque of the Muslims is believed to rest on an area once important to the Knights Templar. The Knights got their name from the former courtyard of Solomon's Temple, which they converted to their headquarters. Legend has it that an underground building beneath the courtyard once stabled Solomon's horses. Later, the Knights also used it to protect their horses. The Crusaders converted the beautiful Muslim holy place, the Dome of the Rock, to a Christian shrine. They called it Templum Domini. To this day, a grillwork put in place by the Crusaders protects the huge holy rock in the center of the dome from visitors who want to touch the stone. Muslim forces under the Egyptian Sultan Saladin regained control of the city in 1187. When Saladin arrived, the Jewish pilgrims also began returning to the city en masse, being less afraid of the Turks than of the Crusaders. By 1190, there was again a sizable Jewish community behind the city walls. In fact, in 1211 AD, a journey to the old city by about 300 French and English rabbis was graciously allowed by the Muslim rulers. However, during this period, the old walls of the city were torn down. The Muslim rulers wanted the city as open as possible to discourage any future Crusader initiatives. Jerusalem was now open to all comers. But in 1250 AD, Jerusalem fell into the hands of another Muslim group known as the Mamelukes. These former slaves began gaining power in Egypt in the late 13th century. These hardline Muslims took Jerusalem from Saladin's armies and once again began closing the city, establishing it as a holy Muslim site. During this occupation, neither Jews nor Christians were allowed on the Temple Mount. Various military and religious leaders across Europe managed to organize a few later crusades. However, these efforts never had the enthusiasm of those early attempts to protect the holy sites of Jerusalem. And thankfully, by the late 13th century, the Crusades became a bad memory. Today, most Christian leaders agree that the Crusades were a serious error and resulted in the deaths of thousands of innocent people. Their effects continue to influence the world to this day. Those holy quests hardened Muslim attitudes toward Christians and began raising doubts in the minds of lay people everywhere about the total authority of the Christian Church. But a few positive things did happen. The Crusades prompted otherwise isolated people to learn about different cultures and religions. And they began casting doubt on the well-established idea of religious conversion by force. However, one of the last Crusades was led by Frederick II of Germany. He took charge of the Sixth Crusade to Jerusalem in 1228 and was ousted by the Turkish mercenary Quartzamian in 1244. After Frederick's departure, except for a brief period from 1248 through 1254, Jerusalem would not see Christian rule for nearly 700 years. Early rulers always kept the Jaffa Gate locked from sunset to dawn. Those needing to enter the city before the gate was opened could often be seen lowering themselves over the wall with ropes. On Fridays, the iron gates were locked at noontime to ensure no infidel would take over the city while the Muslims were at prayer. Jewish visitors who saw Jerusalem for the first time through the Jaffa Gate were required to tear their clothes as a sign of mourning for their loss of the city of David. A rabbi was stationed at the gate to supervise this task. The Jaffa Gate, along with the Damascus Gate, are the two main entrances into the Old City. The gate is one of the most important openings through the walls because it is the main link between Old Jerusalem and the New City to the west. Each day, masses of people intent on commerce or spiritual fulfillment march through this gate. Facing west, the Jaffa Gate traditionally marked the start of the old road to Jaffa, which is a Mediterranean port city about 40 miles away. The traffic through the gate began growing in the middle part of the 19th century, when a second city began developing outside the walls. Traditionally, residents were leery of leaving the protection of their walls. Only a few, if any, settlements could ever be found outside Old Jerusalem. But as the old city began to decline from within, a few brave souls began looking to the open areas outside the Jaffa Gate. The father of the new city that emerged was an Englishman of Jewish descent, Sir Moses Montefiore. The son of a wealthy merchant, Montefiore became a generous philanthropist, with a yen to make dramatic changes in the lives of Jerusalem. Montefiore came to the old city as a tourist in the mid-19th century. He was appalled by the dirty and diseased conditions inside the city walls. He took as a personal cause an effort to improve the quality of life of the residents by moving them into new settlements outside the city. In 1854, he began building a neighborhood across the valley from the Jaffa Gate, known as the Mishkanot Shah Ananim. To supply cheap flour for future tenants, Montefiore imported a huge windmill from England which was brought to Jerusalem piece by piece on the backs of camels. Strange that a European windmill should come to symbolize the suburbanization of Jerusalem. At first, no one came to Montefiore's neighborhoods. They dared not live like this, exposed to harm and persecution, in the wilderness outside the city walls. The workers at Montefiore's cotton factory and windmill proved to be a bickering, lazy, and divided lot. It has been said that some rival Jewish workers at another mill hired a Kabbalist priest to cast the evil eye on Montefiore's efforts. The windmill broke down, replacement parts never arrived, and it never ran again. It appeared that Montefiore's projects were destined to fail. However, a few years after his pioneering effort languished, a plague struck inside the gates, and residents were forced to look at resettling outside the old city. However, shortly after Montefiore's projects began in 1854, a Jewish culture that was exclusive, unbending, and resistant to change established the Orthodox community of Mea Sha'arim. Mea Sha'arim means 100 gates, and it is said that when the area was built in 1875, it was fortified with walls and 100 gates to keep the world and its temptations at bay. Today's gates warn tourists and other worldly influences not to enter. The row houses of Mea Sha'arim form a fortress-like setting. Enter these gates and one is inside an ultra-Orthodox Eastern European ghetto of the 18th century. The predominant language is Yiddish, not Hebrew. The nation of Israel, for the most part, is not recognized by the inhabitants of Mea Sha'arim because the Jewish Messiah has not yet come. They call themselves Haradim, which means God-fearing. The dress code for men and women is identical to that of their ancestors of the Polish ghetto in 1870. Their simple attire includes fur hats, black coats, beards, and long locks of hair for men. Women sport shaved heads, wigs, and scarves, with conservative long dresses and high knee socks. Established in 1870 by Rabbi Vilna Gaon of Lithuania, the community is funded and assisted by like-minded ultra-Orthodox communities from all over the world. Their schools, called yeshivas, still actively debate the Torah. Their synagogues are often festive places and are the center of religious life. Special rabbis perform traditional circumcisions. Young schoolboys kiss the Torah for the first time and are rewarded. Prayer scrolls known as tefillim or phylacteries are bound to the arms and foreheads. From sundown Friday until sundown Saturday, Shabbat is strictly observed. Police barriers prohibit vehicle traffic into Mea Sha'arim. Stores are closed. Writing, handling of money, and the operation of any kind of machinery is strictly forbidden. Today, automobiles traveling from the new city enter Old Jerusalem through an enlarged breach in the wall near the Jaffa Gate. The hole was cut in about 1898 by Turkish rulers. During this period, Jerusalem was still part of Turkey's Ottoman Empire. Events that were later to plunge the world into the First World War were beginning to play themselves out in the Middle East. An uneasy alliance had developed between the Germans and the Turks. German Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm II and his wife were set to meet with their Turkish allies in Jerusalem. However, a strange problem of international etiquette developed. The Kaiser insisted that he should make a grand entrance into the city to impress the Turkish leaders. He planned to enter through the old Jaffa Gate on horseback, accompanied by a large entourage in open carriages. This grand idea presented a problem for the Turkish authorities. Not only did the angled opening of the old gate make a mounted entry difficult, if not impossible, but according to Muslim tradition, only a conqueror could ride his horse through the gates of Jerusalem. A solution was finally found. The Turks ripped a large hole in the wall near the Jaffa Gate and built a road large enough to accommodate the Kaiser riding in his horse-drawn carriage. The Kaiser rode into the city not as a conqueror, but as a visiting dignitary. The hole is still used for automobile traffic. Jerusalem continued to languish under Turkish rule. The city became tired, dirty, and its infrastructure was almost non-existent. Christians and Jews suffered under heavy prejudice. They weren't allowed to do some of the most basic things: ride horses, ring bells, repair their churches or synagogues. Once an intellectual capital, the city's cultural life began to disappear. By 1890, not a single operating printing press could be found in the old city. Ironically, during this time, the ideas that formed the modern nation of Israel were first introduced in Europe by a man who became the father of Zionism. Born in Budapest in 1860, Theodor Herzl was appalled by the anti-Semitism he witnessed as a correspondent covering the Dreyfus Affair in Paris in the late 1890s. He decided that the only solution to the problem would be the creation of a Jewish national state. An audacious bluffer, he went from nation to nation negotiating for a new homeland, but was turned down every time. He wrote and published The Jewish State in 1896, a how-to guide for national independence. Herzl also founded the World Zionist Congress in 1897 and served as its president until his death in 1904 at the age of 44. 13 years later, during World War I, Herzl's dream of a Jewish homeland would become reality as the British won control of Palestine from the Turks and lent a sympathetic ear to the calls of the Zionists. One of the most triumphant scenes of World War I came in 1917, when British General Sir Edmund Allenby entered the Jaffa Gate to accept the Turkish surrender of Palestine. In contrast to the German Kaiser, Allenby voluntarily dismounted and walked his horse through the gate. Ironically, Allenby was in fact eligible to ride through as a conqueror, but he chose the gesture of humility instead. Allenby accepted the Turkish surrender at one of the most dramatic sites in the old city, the huge defensive guard tower and fortress known as the Citadel and David's Tower. The name David's Tower can be confusing, since the structure was built well after David's reign. It is believed early Byzantines mistook the site for the tomb of David, thus creating the name. The structure was actually built by Herod the Great as part of a three-tower system to protect his luxurious palace. It is located on some of the highest ground in the city, making it one of the most strategic defensive locations in the city. When Titus and the Roman legions conquered Jerusalem in the middle of the 1st century, the Citadel was one of the final buildings to fall. In fact, it took the Romans almost a month after they had captured the city before they were able to occupy the Citadel. Following the 1917 Turkish surrender, a new group of rulers took over Jerusalem, the British. Prior to the surrender, several Allied nations had signed a secret agreement to make Palestine an Arab state, with control of the region split between Britain and France. As part of the agreement, the British ended up with Jerusalem. The next 32 years posed numerous problems between both the British and the Jewish people. During the short British reign, the old city began a program of restoration. The railway line to the Jaffa harbor was repaired. Holy sites were refurbished, and new museums, hotels, and hospitals were opened. Buildings sprang up all over the city.
The British showed an interest in keeping and maintaining the ancient character of the old city. British Governor Sir Ronald Storrs even decreed that any new structures built must use the local pink and beige stone that was so prevalent in the older sites around Jerusalem. Religious pilgrims, especially Jewish ones, could now freely come and go. And they began coming in record numbers. However, many who came were more than just visitors. Following World War II, Jewish survivors of the Holocaust wanted to return to their homes in Eastern Europe. They were shocked to discover that they were still unwelcome. From August 1945 to May 1946, 64 ships left Europe, bringing 73,000 refugees to Palestine, who intended to settle in the homeland of their ancestors. They were aided by the underground Jewish army, the Haganah. But the British clung to their 1939 immigration limits because of Arab pressure. British forces turned back overcrowded ships or put illegal refugees into overcrowded internment camps. As an act of rebellion against the British, the Haganah proceeded to blow up 9 key bridges in Palestine in one night. On July 22, 1946, an entire wing of Jerusalem's beautiful King David Hotel exploded and collapsed. The bombing killed 91 people. The Irgun, a terrorist organization led by the late Menachem Begin, claimed responsibility. The ongoing tensions and loss of life was too much, and the British people began calling for withdrawal. In February 1947, Great Britain's cabinet decided to let the United Nations resolve the Palestine problem. After 9 months of debating, the UN produced a plan to partition Palestine between a Jewish and an Arab state. On November 29, 1947, the UN General Assembly voted in favor of the plan. Even as Jews danced in the streets, Arab rioting erupted throughout Palestine. In the first 5 months of 1948, every isolated Jewish village was attacked. In less than 6 months, 6,000 Jewish soldiers and civilians were killed. On May 15, 1948, the British pulled out of Palestine, and the Jewish State of Israel was born. Nowhere are the scars of the 1948 War of Independence more apparent than at the incredible Zion Gate. The gate was one of the focal points of the heavy fighting that broke out following the British retreat. As soon as the British troops were out of sight, the various Arab and Jewish factions of the city began vying for control of strategic sites within the gates. Some of the lopsided battles did go a long way toward helping build the Jewish army's later reputation for toughness. In one brief battle in mid-May, a ragtag Jewish force under Colonel David Shatil briefly took control of the Zion Gate. But to get the gate, they had to nearly destroy it. The War of Independence lasted for 7 months. Israel was victorious, except in Jerusalem. The Jewish quarter of the Old City could not hold out against overwhelming opposition, and ultimately fell to Jordanian legionnaires. At first, the city sustained only minor damage, but after Jewish nationalists surrendered to the victorious Jordanians, real destruction began to occur. Arab militants looted synagogues, schools, and homes, then began dynamiting structures in the Jewish quarter. In the end, 27 synagogues were destroyed, including the historic Nachmanides Synagogue that dated from 1267. For nearly 19 years, the area around the Zion Gate became a no-man's land between Israelis and the Jordanians. To wander into the area was to invite sniper fire from the Jordanian troops manning the ramparts of the old city wall. Concrete barriers were erected to protect pedestrians. Not until after the Six-Day War in 1967 could the Jewish people rebuild and restore the Jewish quarter. It is now one of the most modern and attractive parts of the old city. Even today, one of the first things a visitor to the Zion Gate notices is the bullet holes that dot the wall around the old entryway. The fighting during the 1948 War of Independence wasn't the first conflict this old gate had seen. It was even designed to provide a defense for the city during the frequent wars and battles it had to live through over the centuries. The Zion Gate, like the Jaffa Gate, makes a turn as it passes through the city wall. The idea was to make it difficult for a mounted soldier, especially one carrying a lance, to maneuver through the gate. The result today is that the gate frequently provides a dangerous passage for modern automobiles. Many a vehicle has lost a headlight or sustained a crumpled fender, making the sharp turn. After gaining control of the old city, Jordan closed off the Jewish quarter and denied access to the Jewish holy sites, including the Western Wall. Unable to pray at the Holy Wall, Israelis found that the only place where they could catch a glimpse of the sacred wall was Mount Zion, just outside the Zion Gate. Mount Zion was a quiet land between the warring forces, and it provided a place to congregate for prayer. The Jewish people frequently gathered together to pray that the Holy Wall would again be open to the nation. But even after a 1949 ceasefire, the Western Wall remained off-limits. So the spiritual significance of Mount Zion continued to grow. The small mountain, which gave the Zion Gate its name, became a holy site for all three of the major religious groups of Jerusalem. The Jewish, the Christians, and the Muslims all built shrines near the top. In earlier times, when the city's walls protected a much larger area, the mount was actually inside the city gates. But when Suleiman the Magnificent rebuilt the walls in the 16th century, the mount was left outside. One of the holy sites on Mount Zion is the Tomb of David, often identified as the last resting place of the Jewish king. Many historians say the tomb isn't old enough to hold David's remains, but it continues to be a popular site for pilgrims. Mount Zion is also the location of the Cenacle, which is said to be one possible site of Christ's Last Supper, or Passover Seder. Many historians doubt the authenticity of this location, but nearly all agree that the Last Supper probably took place somewhere on Mount Zion. Today, there are a number of religious institutions on Mount Zion. There is a rabbinical seminary where young Jewish men study for a life steeped in the Mishnah and the Gemara, which makes up the Talmud, the codified oral law of Judaism. There are Christian institutions, including a seminary where young Greeks study for the priesthood. Mount Zion affords a wonderful view to the west into the modern city of Jerusalem, and to the east, the Mount of Olives. Today, the beautiful Mount of Olives and the surrounding Kidron Valley are dotted with Muslim and Jewish cemeteries. On the Mount of Olives, the Jews buried their dead by the tens of thousands. Today, the vast burial ground here is the largest cemetery in the world. To be buried here is to be, in the Jewish tradition, the first to awaken upon the coming of the new Messiah. The price for a burial on this highly strategic ground is over $50,000 per plot. The dead in Jerusalem have always, according to Jewish law, been buried outside the confines of the city. Thus, we can always know the city limits by the location of Jewish cemeteries at any given time in history. Because of the desire not to build or live on or near a cemetery, the old city has remained hemmed in by graves on all sides and has expanded very little except in the last century. Jerusalem abounds with underground tombs as well as above-ground cemeteries. The cool, haunting interiors of these crypts can be explored by the more adventurous pilgrim. The very rich could afford magnificent burial sites, like the tomb of Absalom, the tomb of Zechariah, and the tomb of the Pharaoh's daughter in the Kidron Valley. Many date to the 7th century BC. Nearly 2,000 years ago, the Mount Zion region was also home to a devout group of Jewish clerics, the Essenes. In fact, many believe a gate named after the Essenes once existed in the general area where the Zion Gate is now located. The Essenes supported themselves by preparing Torah scrolls, writing the 5 books of Moses on thin sheepskin parchments. The Essenes are believed to have authored the famous Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found purely by accident in 1947. The scrolls were stored in ancient pottery jars in a desert cave near the monastery of the Essenes at Qumran. The well-preserved old scrolls, which date back to about 200 years before Christ, are believed to be the earliest manuscripts of the Old Testament, sacred to both Jews and Christians. The scrolls now rest in a dramatic museum known as the Shrine of the Book, which was designed to resemble the tops of the jars in which the scrolls were found. Many Jewish and Christians point to the similarity between some of the ancient preserved writings and the current Old Testament. They see this as evidence for the historical accuracy of the biblical texts through the centuries. The Essenes were people of extreme faith. They toiled for countless hours to make sure holy texts would be available to future generations, even though they believed the world would soon end. One fascinating parallel in the Muslim, Jewish, and Christian faiths is that the 3 groups trace their spiritual lineage back to the patriarch Abraham. Islam's most sacred book, the Quran, calls Abraham one who turned away from idolatry and came to his Lord with an undivided heart. The Quran calls Islam the religion of Abraham. Jewish and Christians alike claim Abraham as the ultimate ancestor of both their faiths. Many even trace the heavily Muslim Arab people to Abraham's son, Ishmael, and trace the Jewish people to Isaac, Ishmael's stepbrother. Yet this common lineage hasn't enabled the 3 groups to live together peacefully. The centuries of fighting between the Jewish people and the Muslims, and the bloody Christian crusades, indicate the history of misunderstandings that have historically overshadowed the shared background. However, despite their differences, Muslims, Jews, and Christians made one significant contribution to world history. Together, they held to the idea of one God. The peaceful reverence of Jerusalem's holy sites never seems to last long. Always war or terrorism or religious conflict comes along to disturb the worship. For instance, following the 1948 War of Independence, the next major battle came in 1967, a sudden and violent upheaval called the Six-Day War. The Six-Day War began on June 5th, when the Israelis became concerned about an Egyptian naval blockade in the Suez Canal and the Red Sea. Under the Jewish commander Moshe Dayan, Israeli forces liberated Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula, as well as the West Bank and the Golan Heights. In Jerusalem, the Jewish army struck Jordanian positions in the Old City, attacking through the Lion's Gate. There was fierce house-to-house fighting in the tiny alleyways and twisting streets of the Old City. But within hours, Jerusalem was under Jewish control. For the first time in thousands of years, the Jewish nation possessed the Western Wall and the other holy sites. The years to follow have been eventful and often bloody in the Old City, but the Jewish faithful still pray freely at the Western Wall. Muslims still control the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount. And Christian pilgrims still openly trace Christ's footsteps around the 14 stations of the cross. But the mystery is, what does the future hold for Old Jerusalem? Perhaps the future can be seen through the Old City's only sealed gate, the spectacular Golden Gate, the Gate of Destiny. Believers from all the faiths in Jerusalem instinctively realize that the future holds big things for the ancient Golden Gate. The Golden Gate is actually a huge double entrance, the only gate to cut directly through the city wall into the sacred Temple Mount area. Arabs refer to the southernmost of the two openings as the Gate of Mercy, and the northernmost as the Gate of Repentance. This reflects their belief that the gate will someday be part of the last judgment of man at the end of history. The original gate was apparently constructed in the 7th century by the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius. Legend has it that the gate was built to allow Emperor Heraclius to return a sacred relic, believed to be from Christ's cross, to the Holy Sepulchre in the city. It is said that the emperor built the gate to allow his army to make a triumphant entrance into the city, proudly bearing the sacred prize. Later, when the city came under Muslim control, the gate was completely walled in. The Muslims sealed the gate in an attempt to thwart Jewish prophecy that a returning Messiah or Savior would enter the city through the Golden Gate. For good measure, they placed a cemetery just outside the gate, in the belief that the Jewish Messiah would be a high priest and therefore forbidden by Jewish law to enter a cemetery, as he would become defiled and unable to perform his priestly duties. Some Orthodox Jewish leaders dispute this, claiming the Messiah will be a descendant of King David and not a high priest. The Messiah could therefore travel through a cemetery without violating any laws. Many Christians join in this prophecy about the importance of the gate, agreeing that it will be an entrance for a Messiah. However, they believe that the true Messiah came nearly 2,000 years ago in the form of an itinerant Jewish preacher named Jesus of Nazareth. They now expect their Christ or Messiah, Jesus, to return to Jerusalem as a final act, re-entering the city through the Golden Gate. All three religious groups expect dramatic and spectacular occurrences during these end-time events. Jewish people and Muslims alike expect these final happenings to concentrate on the nearby Mount of Olives and in the Kidron Valley that spreads out in front of the Golden Gate. Christians find in the New Testament book of Luke that Jesus Christ fulfills most of the messianic prophecies of the Old Testament. The Old Testament speaks of two appearances of the Messiah, the first as a lamb and the second as a lion. When he returns as the lion, in that day he will wrap up history as we know it. In the New Testament Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is quoted as saying that the Messiah's return will be as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west. So shall the coming of the Son of Man be. Matthew's portrayal of the last days is strangely similar to the predictions of the end time in the Old Testament book of Zechariah. That prophecy calls for the Jewish Messiah to stand on the Mount of Olives, which is in front of Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives will be split in its middle from east to west by a very large valley, so that half of the mountain will move toward the north and the other half toward the south. One of the most marvelous events in the end-time prophecies of the Old Testament calls for the pious dead of the earth to rise from their graves when the Jewish Messiah returns. Orthodox Jewish believers expect their Messiah to blow a ram's horn to call forth the dead. The Jewish faithful who are waiting for their Messiah believe that when he comes, he will lead the reconstruction of a Jewish empire and will initiate the building of the third temple on the old Temple Mount. There is argument about the promised Jewish empire, with some Israelis believing the current nation of Israel fulfills that promise. Others think there is an even more glorious state to come. All these end-time events would provide a spectacular closing scene for Earth's human drama. But all the ancient prophecies could put the diverse religious believers of Jerusalem on a spiritual collision course. Many of the most strongly held beliefs and prejudices of the old city's faithful would obviously come into direct conflict during the events leading up to the Day of Judgment. The biggest clash of these final days could actually begin at the most sacred of Jerusalem's holy sites, the Temple Mount. In 1967, when Israel captured the Old City and the Temple Mount, it tried to preserve peace by allowing Muslims to administer the sacred site. Muslim leaders reacted strongly, forbidding any Jew or Christian from praying openly on the holy ground. They also refused to permit the building of any synagogues or churches anywhere inside the temple complex. Any hint of rebuilding the old Jewish temple is considered an outrage by Muslims, and many of the more zealous have sworn to defend the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque to the last drop of their blood. Yet Jewish tradition holds that God has irrevocably commanded that a new temple be built. The Jerusalem Talmud says Jews may even build a temporary temple before the Messianic era begins. In fact, a group of Jerusalem residents are working out plans for the third temple even today. Each day, Jewish faithful at the Western Wall pray the popular prayer, "May it be thy will that the temple be speedily rebuilt in our days." And each day, Muslim faithful become more and more dedicated to keeping their holy sites on the Temple Mount intact. Of the 8 gates surrounding Old Jerusalem, the Golden Gate is being watched continuously by Christians, Muslims, and the Jewish faithful. For the Jewish faithful, the Golden Gate symbolizes the entry for the Messiah and the beginning of a messianic age. For the Christians, this gate promises the second coming of Jesus, their Savior. For Muslims, the Golden Gate will someday be part of the Last Judgment at the end of history. And so, like strands of rope which intertwine without ever really joining, this is a city interwoven with the dreams, hopes, and the desires of the 3 great Western religions. Here, the very act of living is a sacrament. The feat of surviving against all odds for thousands of years is the miracle. And the stones and gates provide mute testimony to the difficulty of just keeping one's faith alive in this holiest of lands. When these gates are open, they represent reception, tolerance, and inclusion. They are the meeting point of men of different races, religions, and beliefs. When the gates are or have been closed, they represent exclusion, intolerance, and fear. Men of different races, religions, and beliefs are censored, exiled, or slaughtered. The lesson to be learned is a difficult one. Like the human mind, the 8 gates of Jerusalem are strongest, as they are today, when they are open. If there is hope to be found in these gates, it is that they will always remain open to those who come seeking peace. These are the doorways to the one city on earth which celebrates our relationship with God. All have come from the same Creator, and all will return the same way. They have built this house together. The challenge is to enter it with grace, respect, and tolerance, and then to leave it undamaged for those who follow. Then, and only then, will the gates of time be the gates to the city of peace.
Thank you for joining me for our journey through the gates of time, the story of the 8 gates of Jerusalem. From the Zion Gate, I'm Richard Kiley.